Thank you. So before I share the presentation, I'll just give you a brief background on what I've done over the years so that you're comfortable with my right to talk to you about these things. So I started off in the UK looking at tropical agroforestry. So I did my research from a PhD in Kenya in East Africa. And when I finished that, I ended up getting my first job in Perth, Western Australia, but that was in plantation research. And I worked in plantations and forests for the first 10 years of 2000 in both Western Australia, but also in Victoria. I was based at the Creswick campus of the University of Melbourne. And then in about 2007, I moved down to Burnley. Burnley campus is the home of horticulture, and that's where I'm based now. And after arriving in 2007, I gradually got persuaded to do more and more research in urban ecosystems, in gardens, in parks, with street trees. And I don't have a horticultural background in the same way that a lot of the other people that do research in Burnley have, but I have a quantitative ecosystem process background. And that's what gives me a lot of strength in quantifying things like the cooling benefits or the microclimates, or stormwater runoff, those sorts of things that we're interested in greening as a solution or part of the solution. So that's really my background with regards to horticulture at Burnley. And I've been, as Jimena said, since 2010, that's been my bread and butter, teaching and researching that. So let's share. I think that's it. There we go. Hopefully you can see the first slide, which is using vegetation and water to cool our green spaces. And this is a talk that I was invited to do by the City of Port Phillip, but I understand the recording can be made available to the whole suite of local councils that are part of the My Smart Garden network, and that's a really good resource for people to use. So the research I'm presenting I've supervised, but it's of various students and collaborators along the way. And I'm not going to make it too heavy on the science, hopefully. If you do have questions, as I said, just shout out. The City of Melbourne, the inner city of Melbourne, that's the CBD area, is one of the world's first cities or local government areas that has embraced the need for a heat officer. Krista Milne is one of the co-chiefs of heat management for the City of Melbourne. There are others in Miami and other international global cities. But this is a quote that Krista gave recently. In Australia, as around the world, heat, and especially urban heat, kills more people than any other natural hazard. Yet it's hard to understand. And that means it doesn't become a big issue and people don't prepare for it. And this is very true. It's harder to quantify, it's harder to get your head around than things like flood or fire. Those are very stark and in your face natural hazards. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, less than a year ago announced this, which I think is a great quote. It's rather dramatic. The era of global warming has ended. That's great news. But unfortunately, the era of global boiling has arrived. So people are getting very concerned about these extreme heat events. And in local government and in cities and the public media, people talk about heat all the time. But what are they talking about when they talk about temperature? Very often they talk about surface temperature. This is what is driving a lot of decisions. Surface temperature, which is either coming from satellite monitoring or from aeroplane flyovers or from individual handheld devices. And you'll have seen these sort of colored images where you can tell what it is. You can see a car, a garage, and some asphalt and a tree. And it's giving you an indication of the surface temperature of those objects. That's a great way of getting some coarse preliminary data. Okay. The other way that we measure temperature is with air temperature sensors, like the Bureau of Meteorology does, in their little white Stevenson shields here. This is the classic way of measuring air temperature, but it only measures air temperature at this very location. Above here, you can guesstimate the surface temperature of lots of surfaces. Here, you're getting a spot location measurement of air temperature. Very different, surface temperature and air temperature. And the third metric that I want to bring into the conversation is called human thermal comfort, because that's what we experience. That's what drives our physiological response to heat. That's what leads to whether you end up just having a headache or you end up having a heat stroke and having to go in an ambulance to the hospital. It's this human thermal comfort. And to get an indication of that, you need to measure not only air temperature in a Stevenson screen like that, but also you have to have an understanding of relative humidity. That's the moisture held within the air. You also have to have an idea of how fast is the wind moving. Is it helping you stay cool by moving fast, or is it still and therefore not helping you stay cool? And then the final one is an indicator of the radiation from the sun or from other objects hitting your body. We call that the black globe. And inside this metal black globe, it's hollow, is a temperature sensor in there. And that receives radiation from all directions, 360 degrees. Obviously, the most important one is, if it's open to the sun, is solar radiation. But then you can have radiation reflected off the car park or a window or a wall that can also, from a different angle, influence the heat load that an individual body would receive. So you need those four metrics to estimate human thermal comfort. And it's very important that we talk about those differences, because surface temperature is the easiest to measure. That's great. It's the easiest to map. That's also great. But it's also often measured just once in a year. And then that drives decisions from that point on. And it really doesn't represent what we experience as humans. Because very often wind movement, those sorts of things, what we're doing in that location, whether it's the surface of a tree or the surface of a building, we're not experiencing that. But that's what the map is telling us when it's taken by a satellite or an aeroplane. It's telling us the surface of all of those other objects. It's better to get an indication of air temperature. And the Bureau of Meteorology has a course network, but the Internet of Things is enabling us to get better and better detail about air temperature. It's harder to map because individual sensors are required, but it is getting closer to what we experience. And the other good thing is it's the metric of what we're concerned about globally, global warming. So we all hear this 1.5 degree warming or 2 degree warming. Well, air temperature is in the same centigrade scale. So if we're able to map in the same centigrade scale, we should be able to understand whether our initiatives, either in the public streetscape, in your private garden or a park, are getting some way to offsetting global warming, keeping up with it in a way. Oops. I'm not sure what I've done there. Anyway, the third one is human thermal comfort or stress. And that's the one that is hardest to measure because you have to measure all four of those metrics. It best represents what we are experiencing, but it is generic. Okay, just because the four metrics suggest that it's a stressful day or a stressful location, one person who has an existing health condition would say, yeah, it is, I'm stressed. But a young, healthy person may say, no, I'm fine. So it does still depend on the individual whether this is a stressful, a thermally uncomfortable situation or not. But there is lots of evidence that using human thermal comfort can really strongly indicate whether you're going to end up with large hospitalizations and even mortality in certain locations and with certain heatwave events, for example. So that's why it's a very powerful metric. So we've covered the three temperatures. We're now not going to talk about surface temperature anymore because I'm not a fan. But we are going to talk about air temperature and human thermal comfort. Human thermal comfort is very often communicated in degrees centigrade. That's what makes, we can understand a degree centigrade scale now because we hear it every day on the weather report. But when you see something on a human thermal comfort scale, you have to look at what the verbal catchphrase is for it. Between 32 and 38, strong heat stress. 38 to 46, very strong heat stress. So it's this color-coded description that is really important to lead to action or to lead to warnings being set. So you'll see these colored repeated, and you'll see these phrases repeated in some of what I'm going to present. So now we've gone through the temperatures, let's talk about the three things we're going to discuss today. These three possible strategies to reduce urban heat. These strategies could be undertaken by the City of Port Phillip in public parks. It could be undertaken in streetscapes, or homeowners can undertake these sort of strategies in their own private open space, garden or courtyard. Okay. So the first one is overhead canopy shade. And I'm taking away the punchlines. I'm giving you the punchlines already. Okay. So we're not writing a thriller or going through a thriller. You know that Stephen is going to be telling you and providing the scientific evidence that overhead canopy shade is the best way to reduce air temperature. And it's the best way to reduce human thermal stress. The other strategy, irrigating green space. It could be turf, could be a front garden or backyard turf lawn, or it could be a native garden. But if you're irrigating it, keeping the soil moist and keeping the plants healthy, it will reduce air temperature. Maybe not as much as tree canopy overhead shade, but it is still reducing air temperature locally in your garden or in that park. But it may not provide a significant human thermal comfort benefit. Trees do, because they're stopping the solar radiation getting to you. Irrigating green space does not stop that solar radiation getting to you on a warm, hot summer's day. So it can reduce air temperature, but it may not have a significant benefit on your thermal comfort, how you sense that day in that place. Okay? The third strategy that has become more and more common recently, and is very common in some Southeast Asian countries and cities, is misting. Misting in very targeted locations to create a haze of pure water. It has to be clean water. You cannot do this with anything but potable drinking water because of the hazards of aerosols and passing on diseases. But if you do have a clean system, misting can slightly reduce air temperature, but it will significantly reduce human thermal stress because it's going to get you wet. That is its purpose. Irrigation can get you wet if you run through the sprinklers, like children do on a summer's day, but misting is meant to get you wet, to cover your face, to cover your clothes, and that is its cooling benefit, is by wetting you, effectively doing what sweat does. Because we sweat ourselves to try and cool ourselves. By the mist falling on our bodies, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to use some of the heat that we've accumulated, and by that water going into vapor, being evaporated, it takes some of our heat away from us. It uses some of that heat. And so, yes, it's a good one for human thermal comfort, but it may not reduce the air temperature in the same way that some people have been claiming. Okay, so that's what's coming up. And we're only talking about air temperature, and we're only talking about human thermal comfort. So when I say overhead canopy, I really mean tree canopies or something like an arbor or a gazebo area, some structure that has climbing plants draped over it, vines or wisterias, this sort of thing, okay? So that's how we get our overhead canopy. An overhead canopy, generally trees and tree canopy within a street, a park or a private garden, can reduce air temperatures by up to 2 degrees centigrade in summer during the day. Generally, it's going to be up to about 1 or 2 degrees. 2 degrees is the max I've ever measured. You'll hear lots of people telling you that we've got 5-degree benefits from this and 5 degrees benefits from that. But unfortunately, I would have to disagree with the methods that they're using to measure that or to indicate that. It really is just up to 1 to 2 degrees centigrade air temperature. And it can lead to those spaces being slightly warmer at night because it reduces the ability of those streets or gardens or parks to dissipate heat at night. Okay. But the human thermal comfort benefits during the day, if you're outside, are profound because you will feel a lot cooler, because the main contender, that solar radiation from the sun, is being absorbed by that canopy. But we do also have to recognize, especially as, you know, I just mentioned those heat officers at the City of Melbourne at the start, they're really concerned about heat wave events because that's when you get your hospitalizations and your mortality. The cooling benefit of tree shade can be significantly reduced or less during a heat wave than it is on a warm summer's day. The biggest cooling benefit from trees or overhead canopy is on those 30, 35 degree days. Once you're getting to those 38, 40, 42 degree days, the cooling benefit is much reduced. And I'll get to why that is in a few minutes. So how does this overhead canopy do its job? Well, this is a very simple graphic based on some work that Akbari did in the US. I've just adapted it. So you've got the sun's energy coming down, about 10% on a broadleaf deciduous, let's say a London plane tree here. 10% is reflected back into the atmosphere. So now we're down to 90%. 70% is absorbed by that tree canopy, heats up the leaves and the branches. Effectively, that's what it's doing. Only 20% is actually transmitted or passes through the canopy and reaches the grass, the asphalt, the wall, the window, or the roof beneath that tree. So essentially, that's shade. That's what we mean by shade. Okay? Absorbance by the canopy so that only 20% of that light solar radiation gets through. Okay, so that's the key mechanism by which overhead canopy cools. The other mechanism that a lot of people talk about is evapotranspiration. So evapotranspiration is where water is taken up by the plants, passed through the stem, along the branches, all the way to the leaves, and then is passed out of the leaf into the atmosphere. And when it's in that leaf, it goes from a water phase, a liquid phase, into a vapor phase. Okay, and it's that uses up the heat that has been absorbed over here. Okay, so if the plants didn't do that, they'd cook in a couple of hours, possibly a couple of days. They'd wilt. So this transpiration is an essential mechanism by which the trees can regulate their heat load themselves. And in doing so, they cool themselves, but they also cool the local air body around them. Okay, so it's transpiration is a plus, but it's not as important as shading. The majority of the cooling benefit comes from this on the left-hand side. Maybe 30% comes from the evapotranspiration cooling of the leaves themselves. And you can get the same benefit from a bare soil surface or a water body. Any surface that is able to evaporate water into the atmosphere will cool itself and cool the air around it in the process. Okay, so those are the two mechanisms, and the most important of those is probably this shade on the left-hand side. So let's get some science under our belts. So this is Rosanna Sanusi, who was a PhD student working with me a couple of years back. She's originally from Malaysia. She's gone back to Malaysia now. And she was using these sorts of instruments to quantify human thermal comfort in streetscapes with tree shade and without tree shade. This is from 2014, and this is a heat wave that occurred here. I didn't send her out on a heat wave, don't worry, but we did go out on some 20-degree days, some 25-degree days, and I did send her. I went out as well. It's not just her on a 42-degree day, just one. And we were very careful when we did that. So we collected data from a range of different weather events around this heat wave. And we did this, there was a team of 3 of us, and we did this for one street that was north-south with plane trees. We did exactly the same thing for eucalypt trees on Umaru Street, and also English elm trees on Napier Street here. So we were trying to make sure that the trees changed, the species changed, but the street geometry didn't change. Its orientation, they were single or double story, and you can see the width of these streets are very similar. So we're trying to keep that the same. And what we're essentially doing is measuring, say, here in the open, and then measuring under the tree. Here in the open, and then measuring under a tree. So we're just getting an understanding of what the benefit of those trees in the streetscape was from a human thermal comfort perspective for these three species. This was a 33-degree day. You've got wind speed here. I've said that that's important for human thermal comfort. We've got air temperature here, relative humidity here, and mean radiant temperature from the black globe, this black ball here. So we've got all the four elements for working out human thermal comfort. Air temperature is one of the metrics that we all lean on. And you can see when it says, when you see the white symbols, those are measurements that were taken in the open, like here. In the distance, you can see a measurement taken in the shade. Those are the black dots and the black triangles. So if it's black on the figure, on the graph, it means it was in tree shade. If it's white, it means it was away from the tree in the open. And you can see that the air temperature difference was occasionally 1 to 2 degrees, on average, it was 1 to 2 degrees cooler in the middle of the day when you were under tree shade. So that's not a huge air temperature cooling benefit. But look over here, the mean radiant temperature and the difference in human thermal comfort is really profound. From hot in the open down to slightly warm under tree shade. So that's the benefit of having these vegetation overhead canopy mechanisms that we commonly call trees in our streets, our public places, places where we congregate, and your private gardens. But as I was saying, when you have a very hot day, a heat wave day, such as this day where it reached 43 degrees maximum, you can see now the air temperature difference between being in the open, white triangles or white circles, or being under tree shade, the black symbols, is almost insignificant. And that carries all the way to the human thermal comfort. Yes, it's slightly better under the tree, but it's nowhere near the benefit that we saw on a 33-degree day. And the reason is that on a heat wave day, it's not the sun's energy in that street or in that park or in your garden that's making you stressed, thermally stressed. It's the hot air sweeping from the red center of Australia down upon us. It's the hot air mass that is driving human thermal comfort, not so much the sun that happens to be hitting in this street. It's accumulated sun's energy from weeks and weeks in the center of Australia that's created a hot air body. Okay, so that's why the benefit of tree shade is still there, but it's far less when a hot air mass is making a heat wave. And we have to recognize that when we talk about what vegetation can do for us in a heat wave, because the expectation from a lot of policymakers is that trees are good in summer and they're going to be really good in a heat wave. But that's not quite true, because the weather mechanisms, what's driving the heat, is slightly different. And we need to be aware of that. Okay, any questions or comments about overhead canopy? This is just a reminder. Go for it, Maria. Shout out.
I'm so sorry. Just a very quick question. So I'm kind of curious. I did not really see any data about the difference in species. So you specifically said that you kind of wanted to see. Yep.
Yeah, I didn't want to. There is a lot of interest in the difference of species. I'll just quickly skip back so you can see those three species. So the London plane trees did create the greatest cooling benefit and human thermal comfort benefit. Next, the elms, and least the eucalypts. And that's partly because the eucalypts had a far higher canopy, taller canopy. And that's very common to eucalypts, is that you get, when you have a mature eucalypt tree, the canopy is very vertically high. It's also slightly thinner, but that depends on the species. Okay, so it was plane trees first, elm trees a close second, and eucalypts about half of the air temperature and thermal comfort benefits of the broadleafs. Okay, good question.
Sorry, one more question. So for heat waves, do you reckon, working in trying to reduce the effect of heat waves, do you reckon it will have to do more with like how we design our cities, our streets, so they're not like so straight, probably, so the wind doesn't really go through them that easily, or like.
Yeah, so there's been lots of thoughts about this, and in Europe they've played with the ideas of, if you know that your heat wave tends to come from a certain prevailing wind direction, and for us in Melbourne, it's from the north. Okay, that's one. So we know that if we're going to have a heat wave, it's coming that way. You would prioritize well irrigated tree-based systems, say a plantation or natural forest, but you would irrigate or even mist that area to the north of the area you're concerned about. So that still would only have a very small impact for only a short distance before it would be subsumed by the huge hot air mass that is a heat wave. There really is not a lot you can do about it from an outdoor environment. Well, the thing is that in a heat wave, we can talk about urban greening being part of the solution, but the recommendation is do not be outside. It's as simple as that. If it is a heat wave, don't look for a cool green space. Look for a cool grey space with air conditioning, such as a cinema, shopping centre, these sorts of things. And my bread and butter is urban greening, but that has to be the truth when you're talking about a heat wave. Any other comments before we move on?
Stephen, sorry, I had a question. I just thought it was interesting that you said the height of the eucalypt made a difference. So is there an optimum height for tree kind of canopy to get that optimum?
So if you're wanting to cool in the daytime, having your canopy as close to the human, wrapping around the human is best. Because what you'll then do is keep a body of cool air for longer, because you're reducing the likelihood of the air or the wind from whipping it away. As soon as you have a high canopy, it's very easy for the smallest of wind to whip away any cooling benefit that's achieved locally. Okay, that helps. But again, that can become a problem at night, because it means then that you can't get rid of any hot air. Okay, so you have to, it's give and take in the knowledge. But if it's by day that you're really concerned about, which would apply to tram stops, plazas, streetscapes, anywhere where people congregate outside in the public realm, then yes, you would want your canopy down low as possible, as dense as possible.
But you haven't really quantified it yet, yeah?
No, I haven't quantified those instances, but this data indicates that that is the likely outcome, yeah. Okay, that's just a reminder of what we've covered. Now let's talk about urban green space irrigation. And there's been on the ABC and the BBC, there's been a lot of media conversations about getting rid of turf and getting rid of artificial turf as well, and I'm fine with that. But we do have to recognise some of the benefits that irrigated green space gives us at the same time, if we are going to suggest getting rid of that. These are just two graphics of green space irrigation in a public park. And even, does anybody know what this is on the left-hand side here?
Some sort of like a useful plantation, like a plant that actually is not like a wild plant, but something that is probably making money for somebody.
No, it's
Arabend bat colony.
Yeah, well done, Susie. That's exactly what it is. It's the Arabend Bellbird Picnic Reserve, where we have tens of thousands of flying foxes. And this is an attempt by Parks Victoria to provide a way of locally cooling those colonies on extreme heatwave days. And this is being replicated in Adelaide. It's happening in parts of the Gold Coast, New South Wales, some of them misting, others using sprinklers like this. So it's about using water to cool in a very targeted way, because they regard the returns as being worth the effort or the cost. So this, what we wanted to know, this is a PhD student, Paul Chung, who set up a trial in Burnley to try and understand what the cooling benefit can be from simply irrigating turf grass in a backyard scenario. So what we set up during COVID, this was, because this is the only thing we could do. We couldn't get in the buildings, but we could get in the grounds. So during COVID, we set up these boxes, 6 by 6 meters. So representing some of the private backyards that you'll come across in those outer suburbs where you have very small back gardens. And you can see the instrumentation that was set up inside these. This is simply shade cloth because it was too expensive to simulate a fence. That would cost a bomb. So, but this does restrict that air body from leaving the garden, our simulated backyard. And in the corners, we would have sprinklers so we could direct the water at different rates to create different amounts in those 6 by 6 meter back gardens. So the punchline, let's go straight to the punchlines. What Paul Chung discovered from these studies was that irrigation by day can reduce air temperatures in those back gardens by up to 1 degree. So remember the tree shade that I showed you, 1 to 2 degrees. Just by using irrigation in your backyard, you can get a 1 degree centigrade cooling benefit. But to do that, you have to maintain that soil moisture. Okay, so if you want that cooling benefit all the way through summer, you have to keep your garden or your turf moist all the way through. And same with City of Port Phillip. If they want their parks to cool all the way through summer, they got to keep that grass green and lush, or the gardens green and lush. Okay, so it's a water cost to do that. Daytime irrigation will increase it as compared to nighttime irrigation, because commonly we irrigate our green spaces at night because that's when we know we're not going to be using them. But if you irrigate by day, you will get a greater cooling benefit. And if you irrigate multiple dark times through the middle of the day into the afternoon, then you will really maximize the cooling benefit from an air temperature perspective up to what we're talking about here, up to 1 degrees. But there will be little or even no human thermal comfort benefit from doing this, because you're not taking away the solar radiation, which is driving your human thermal comfort sensation. You're making the air temperature slightly cooler, but you're not taking away that what the black globe experiences, which is what your body experiences, which is that accumulation of solar radiation from all directions. So let's get to the scientific evidence for those statements. As I said, we have to, if you want to do this, you have to think differently about irrigation in gardens or parks, because traditionally we irrigate for plant health and we irrigate for efficiency. We want to use as little water as we possibly can to keep the plants alive so that they look good and we can play footy on them or we can have a picnic there. And we have in the past been using potable water. But if we recognize that in certain suburbs and in certain locations, we have access to the purple pipe, which is either recycled effluent irrigation water or stormwater collected from parks and roofs and stored underground or in large tanks, why can't we irrigate not only for plant health in those locations? We can irrigate for cooling benefit. And you can irrigate by day or night to maximize loss, the complete opposite of efficiency. We're trying to not be efficient. We're trying to get as much water evaporated or transpired from that surface. So it's a paradigm shift. You're thinking about it differently to maximize the cooling benefits. So in a study that lasted about 6 weeks, recently, back in 2021 into 22, so you can see the soil moisture, the difference between irrigating at 2, 4, or 7 millimeters per day as compared to no irrigation. So gradually, as compared to no irrigation, we were getting a 35% soil moisture content increase. And what that led to at the same time was a steady increase in the air temperature difference between not irrigating. Okay, so not irrigating would effectively be this flat line here. And these are the 3 treatments. There was no difference between irrigating 2, 4, or 7. It was all to do with how wet the soil was. And we were able to get up to about 0.8 degree air temperature benefit by the week 6. Okay. So that was an indication of the cooling benefit, which is really being driven by a cumulative soil moisture storage. That meant that the vegetation was transpiring, but it also meant that the soil surface was also evaporating. So this is just another look at the same sort of setup, 6 by 6 meters. But in the second study, Paul looked at the timing of irrigation, just because he could and he was interested. That's what people do in a PhD. He was looking at multiple daytime irrigation events. Could that strengthen the afternoon cooling benefit without using more water? So you can use the same amount, let's say 4 millimeters per day, but rather than applying those 4 millimeters in one event, you apply 1 millimeter, wait an hour, apply another millimeter, wait an hour, apply a third millimeter. So you distribute that 4 millimeters over 4 1 millimeter events. So that's what he did. He had a single 4 millimeters at night, a single 4 millimeters in the middle of the day, and then multiple daytime irrigations of 1 millimeter. Same amount of water, just distributed differently. And this is the sort of thing that he managed to show. This is the single nighttime irrigation event. Again, the 0 line is not irrigating at all. So the single nighttime irrigation event, you get about 0.7 degrees cooler in the afternoon, which is when we're really concerned about human thermal comfort and exposure of outdoor participants or green space users. That's good. A single daytime irrigation event, now you can see this blue bar is the actual irrigation event. And there's a big air temperature drop that you see here, and then recovery. So that all in all, it's about the same as the single nighttime, 0.5 or 0.7. No significant difference between those two. But if you break up the irrigation into discrete 1 millimeter events, you're able to get a significantly greater cooling benefit, up to about 0.9 degrees centigrade cooler than not irrigating at all. Okay. So there you go. That's how we got those statements. Any questions about that? Because this is quite new research that is only just being published now. And it is controversial because people, rightly so, they see the negatives of having so much turf grass in our urban landscapes and are concerned about how our valuable drinking water resources are used. And so that makes complete sense. But as I try to indicate, Australian cities, especially Adelaide and Melbourne, are really forward thinking in how they're recycling wastewater and storing stormwater. And that means in those locations, we can think differently and more creatively about how we use water for cooling. Any questions?
Oui.
Go for it, Maria.
Sorry. So I'm kind of struggling here a little bit. So as you said, you know, this particular type of irrigation, it doesn't really affect the human thermal comfort, right? And that is something that we are particularly interested in and concerned about because we don't want people to be dying, you know, since that's not that important. And obviously, irrigation for plant health can be done much more economically. So I'm not really sure why is that even important to actually do it, just ever do it, this kind of irrigation. It seems wasteful, doesn't really affect human health in any way, shape, or form, or at least doesn't, or very negligibly.
Yep.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure I'm following here. Thank you.
No, those are valid questions. Absolutely. The question that was asked in the previous one about what could you do for a heatwave scenario, and that is irrigate a complex vegetated surface like Billio just before a heatwave. And that's the really only thing you can do about it. And that's using the combination of surface roughness, which the trees provide, and that evapotranspiration, which is what this study was looking at, to make cool air that can pass into the city, but it will gradually dissipate. The other comment about, from a human thermal comfort perspective, you don't get a benefit unless you get wet. And that's why in the first slide, I showed you the benefit to animals, to flying foxes, because you can use irrigation to target threatened species. If we want to keep certain native biodiversity elements in the city, this is really one of the key mechanisms that we can use. Because they're still, on a heat wave day, they're in the trees, they're under the shade, but they're still dying. So if you want to provide some benefit to living organisms other than ourselves, you have to get them wet during those heat wave events. And that's why irrigation, I absolutely agree, you wouldn't want to do it broad scale, but in a targeted location, it is really a powerful tool for biodiversity heat stress management. I hope, does that answer sort of provide one example of how it can be used, Maria?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm always, I'm always a little bit more worried about people than, animals. So, I wasn't thinking about that, but it is a valid point, definitely.
Yep. Yeah, well, the local government, the community is made up of lots of different perspectives. Some people are really strong on urban ecology, urban biodiversity. Some people are really strong on native species only, maybe from a vegetation perspective. Other people don't give two hoots. And Humaina's job is to try and provide the City of Port Phillip's job is to try and provide a response that is meaningful to all of them. And it's I wouldn't want your job, Humaina, but or the City of Port Phillip. But it's what local governments have to wrestle with is this spectrum of perspectives and wants. This
balance. It's interesting because, Maria, I had the similar question. I had the same question in my mind as to, if it's not providing that reduction in stress, but then I thought, I remember the picture of Yarra Bend with the bats, and from a biodiversity perspective, it makes sense. And I'm assuming it would also provide comfort for insects and pollinators and all sorts of really, critical animals in an ecosystem. So it's just, and I'm assuming that having that irrigation and building up that soil moisture, even though that temperature difference isn't huge, I'm imagining that over a period of days or in a heat wave, it may potentially make the heat wave stresses slightly less. I mean, it might be minimal, but and like you said, if we've got access to purple pipe or different sources of water, it might be something to sort of really think about in the future a bit more.
I think thinking about providing cool refuge for valued biodiversity is the way we have to think about the use of both greening and water in combination. Otherwise, you may be providing a dead end for the biodiversity that you value. So you may provide this refuge, a green space habitat, but it's the temperature extremes that we're going to experience in the coming decades will cook them, unless you think more creatively about dealing with those. May only be 5 days, 10 days a year that they need it, but they will need it if you want them to persist in the urban landscape. And so it's about being honest about your urban ecology strategy and providing the techniques and the approaches that can truly keep them without stress and without mass deaths. In the same way that we think about humans, from a human perspective, we make sure that we don't go outside on those heat wave days. We make sure that we communicate that you should go to the cinema or Chadstone or wherever it is where you can find that air-conditioned refuge. Animals can't do that.
Sorry, one more question. I was just thinking about your setup, not to be overly critical or anything, but you did say that you didn't really have enough funding for pulper fences, and you decided to use that mesh or something. But then you said that that mesh was enough to sort of like keep that air pocket. Yeah, so it's sort of like represents that 6 by 6 a meter space. So yeah, I'm not. Yeah, could you please just explain your thinking to me a little bit more, because I kind of feel like mesh is mesh, you know. I mean,
yeah, so that mesh is 70% extinction mesh, so it does reduce wind flow considerably. So my thinking when setting this up is that, in a way, I'm reducing the rate at which that air pocket, let's say the air pocket here between the yellow arrows, is dissipated out. If it was a big green space, that would happen very quickly. So I'm not simulating a backyard with 100% extinction of wind, where you have fences and walls, but I am simulating a larger green space than this. So it's still a green space, because what I'm doing is reducing air leakiness from that space, so that the impact of the irrigation is able to be quantified. If it was a backyard, the irrigation benefit may actually be more, because the air pocket cannot leak out through the fence and the wall. The only way is up and over. So I may be underestimating the irrigation cooling benefit slightly of a backyard. Okay, how are we doing for time, Jimena? Oh, you were on mute then.
We've got about, it's almost 5 to 7 actually, so we're getting close to time, yeah.
So the last one is misting. And this is a study that I did with Southeast Water in Aqua Revo, which is an 8-star, or wants to be an 8-star sustainability estate down near Cranbourne, Lyndhurst. So it's in the southeast of Melbourne. And they wanted to look at courtyard misting as a mechanism to provide cooling benefits. This is a little setup where you can see all of the sensors, and the central part of the courtyard has the wind speed, and it has a black globe and the air temperature sensors. The punchlines: misting in the middle of the day, again, provides a tiny air temperature reduction. But if your body gets wet, and that's the whole purpose of misting, you will get a significant thermal comfort benefit. And repeated misting through the middle part of that day leads to the greatest human thermal comfort benefits. So again, that's why it helps to break this into air temperature benefit and human thermal comfort benefit. We were measuring all of the elements for human thermal comfort, and we had 2 scenarios that we were looking at. We had edge misting or above misting. So the first few months, we just misted from the edge of the courtyard, and then we misted from above. And we did this on one day. We would do it only once in the middle of the day at 1 p.m. for 5 minutes. And on the next day, we would mist, if every time it was above 30 degrees air temperature, that would trigger misting for 5 minutes and then wait for 25 minutes. So on a hot day, you could end up with misting being triggered every half an hour. So what did this lead to in benefit? So this is a visual you can see of the edge misting. As you can see there from above, just misting from this red line into the courtyard, missing the center of the courtyard. Or setting up this misting from above using cables, where you're able to mist downwards onto the courtyard far more effectively. A little bit graphy and sciencey now, but all here where you can see the ambient air temperature from 10 degrees to 50 degrees. The open circles are edge misting, and the black circles are misting from above. The air temperature benefit cooling, as shown by a negative, yeah, there's some days when it's good and some days when it's not so good. You end up over the whole season with a very small cooling benefit of about 0.2 degrees. We can't even measure that accurately. Our sensors have an accuracy of 0.2 degrees. So we can't claim that this led to an air temperature benefit. However, from a human thermal comfort perspective, this black line here is the trend line for the black circles. That's misting from above. And so what that is telling us is that when you mist onto the actual object, hopefully your body, or in this case, the black globe, on the hotter days, you can get a more profound cooling benefit. So this is doing what the tree canopy wasn't doing. If you remember, we were talking about during a heat wave on those really hot days, 38, 40 degrees, we weren't getting the cooling benefit that we wanted. But if you get the human wet through misting, for example, you can. And this is also showing what it looked like with that every half an hour misting event. The red line is the black globe temperature, which is the best indication of mean radiant temperature or human thermal comfort. And you can see that you're able to bring it down. It creeps back up, you bring it down again. So what that led to is a human thermal comfort benefit of around about 4 degrees human thermal comfort. So you may be taking somebody's experience of stress from very hot to hot or from hot to warm. Just one band in that color circle, that color grading of human thermal comfort that we talked about earlier. But it does get a greater human thermal comfort on those hotter days. And that's really important. But again, the advice should always be, on a heat wave day, stay inside. Don't be sitting out in your courtyard trying to mist yourself into comfort. It doesn't quite make sense. It's always better to be inside in an air-conditioned space. So in summary, that's overhead tree shade is best. Irrigation can help to reduce air temperature, but may not help thermal comfort. But misting can produce benefits to human thermal comfort, maybe not as profound as overhead tree shade. So there you go. Just like to thank Paul Chung, who's in that photograph there. Kerry Nice, one of the colleagues from was Monash, now Melbourne. Rosanna Sanusi was the first PhD students, and these are some of the people who helped contribute financially and logistically to making some of that research happen.
Oops. Thanks so much, Stephen. That was really interesting. Lots of food for thought. Does anybody have any questions? I think we've got a comment in the chat. Just going to read that out. Great data to see. Thank you so much for all this information. I've got a really quick question about where you had those tests with the fabric.
Yep.
To sort of simulate a backyard, a small backyard, and the fences. If backyards had less, they weren't fenced, they might have, say, frames with vegetation. How would that impact on sort of like, I guess, the wind, or is it better to let the wind go through? Is that something that should be considered?
Yeah,
have more open.
From a human
Yep.
thermal comfort perspective, having more air movement can really be a benefit. But if you're irrigating and creating a pocket of cooler air, then you probably want to keep it to yourself and not give it to your neighbor.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So if you're doing nothing, then you want air. You want air movement.
Yeah.
But if you are doing something by providing a lot of tree canopy shade or an arbor, or if you're using water to try and cool, you want to keep it to yourself. That would be the better strategy.
Okay.
Selfish, although it is.
But really interesting and important about just keeping that moisture for animals and creatures on hot days. I agree. Like when it's a very hot day, there's not really much point on going outside. Anybody else have any questions? No? Maria?
Hi again. So my question is misting, right? Interesting concept, really interesting. Again, seems to be a bit wasteful. So only potable water can be used, or anything? Well, yeah, I kind of feel like only potable water, probably. Yeah,
Yeah,
realistically.
that's the you won't be allowed to do it with anything other than potable water because of the issues of E. coli, Legionnaire's disease, these sorts of public health issues.
Yeah, all lovely issues by themselves. Yeah. Okay. Mm.
Is it something that's being used a lot, Stephen? Do you know
Yeah,
in sort of public places?
yeah, in certain places in Mediterranean Europe, in restaurant areas and plazas, even in some public transport nodes. In Southeast Asian cities that experience high temperatures, in Japan as well, they do have areas where they know they have a lot of pedestrian activity, and there is no other alternative shade. At that time of the day, they will mist if you are in open sun. Yeah. Even at Moomba this year, apparently, from Susie. Yeah, the Australian Open, that's another one in Australia. The Australian Open has misting refuges because on those, very often in January, we get our heat waves. And it's not just of worry to Djokovic, it's also of worry to the spectators. And those spectators need a way of cooling down, and misting is a really rapid way of getting them.
Okay, thanks very much, Stephen. This recording will be available on the My Smart Garden website soon, and we appreciate you coming along and entertaining us tonight with all that data.
No worries.
Lots of information. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
See ya. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.